There is a gravity to certain stories that announces itself quietly long before the first scene has settled into focus. The tale of Bardock, Goku's father, carries that weight from its very first breath. He was a low-class Saiyan warrior, serving an empire that saw him as little more than a useful instrument. A man of considerable strength, shaped entirely by a world built on conquest and rigid hierarchy. His story is brief, and yet its echo reaches all the way to the final battles on distant Namek. Before drifting off, you can subscribe for more quiet Dragon Ball stories. And let me know where you're listening from tonight, and the world that shaped this warrior was. One of the most unforgiving places the Dragon Ball universe ever quietly described. Planet Vegeta was not a world built for softness. Its atmosphere was heavy, its landscape rocky and red-tinged in certain lights, and the civilization that had grown across its surface was shaped by the same quality that defined everything else on it, which was force. The Saiyan race had developed in a specific direction over the long course of their history, away from the philosophies and arts that other civilizations cultivated, and toward the single quality that their world seemed most interested in rewarding, which was the capacity for combat and the biological advantage of growing stronger through surviving it. There was not a concept in the Saiyan vocabulary that corresponded to the idea of choosing peace. There was preparation, and there was battle, and there was the recovery that allowed for the next battle to begin. And beyond those three things, the structure of a Saiyan life had relatively little else to offer. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. The Zenkai boost was perhaps the most distinctive biological feature of the Saiyan race, the mechanism that transformed near-death experiences into stepping stones rather than simply traumas. When a Saiyan was pushed to the edge of their physical limit and survived it, their body responded by growing significantly stronger than it had been before the encounter. It was not a subtle adjustment. It was a substantial leap in capability, a physiological reward for surviving what should have killed them. And it meant that a Saiyan who went through enough brutal battles emerged from the other side of those battles as something considerably more formidable than they had been at the beginning. This mechanism made the Saiyan race highly effective as conquering soldiers, and simultaneously made them, over time, a population that was trending inexorably toward greater and greater power levels across each generation. A warrior who survived 10 near-death experiences was significantly stronger than a warrior who had survived 2. A warrior who had survived 20 was stronger still. The math of it, carried forward across enough generations, pointed towards something that an empire relying on those warriors might eventually find concerning. Frieza had built his empire on this quality. He understood the Saiyan biological upgrade system well enough to recognize its utility, which was why the Saiyan race had been incorporated into the Frieza force rather than simply eliminated when Frieza consolidated his power. They were efficient, durable, and progressively self-improving in a way that most other available soldier types were not. A Saiyan sent on a difficult mission was likely to return from it stronger than when they departed, which meant that the return on investment for deploying them generally exceeded the upfront cost. This made them valuable in the short and medium term. It also made them, in the long term, a population whose aggregate power level was climbing along a curve that Frieza's private calculations had begun to track with growing attention. The caste system that governed Saiyan life operated in parallel to this biological system and occasionally in tension with it. A Saiyan's caste assignment was determined at birth by their initial power level, the level recorded before any Zenkai boosts had been accumulated, before any battles had been survived. It was a snapshot of a person at their most unformed, their least developed, and it was used to make determinations about the entirety of their life's trajectory. Those born with higher initial readings were classified as elite and given access to the resources and social standing that came with that classification. Those born with lower readings were classified as low class and assigned accordingly regardless of what they might eventually become through their own effort and survival. The system was, in its fundamental structure, a measurement of birthright rather than of capability, and it operated with the unyielding consistency of something that no one within it had any particular incentive to challenge. Bardock was born into the low-class designation, his initial power level placed him among the vast majority of the Saiyan population who would spend their lives in service to the Empire as standard soldiers. Directed at planets considered manageable for warriors of their capability, given the basic equipment and provisions that allowed them to carry out their assignments without requiring anything extra from the administration. He was, by the original terms of the system, exactly the kind of Saiyan the Empire could produce in large numbers and deploy without particular concern. There was nothing in the records of his birth that suggested he would become anything worth distinguishing from the general population of low-class warriors serving the Frieza force on any given day. What the records could not account for was what accumulated over the years of Bardock's actual career. The Zenkai system did not care about caste designations. It responded to survival, and Bardock had proven over the course of his operational life to be extraordinarily good at surviving. Mission after mission, battle after battle, the margin between his capability and the capability of what he was facing had been narrow enough on enough occasions to trigger the biological response that pushed him forward. And the result was a power level that, by the time the story of the Bardock special began, had reached 10,000. That figure represented a significant departure from where he had started, accumulated through the specific mechanism of living through enough that should have ended him. It did not change his caste assignment. The Empire's records still listed him as low class, but it meant that the actual man wearing that designation had grown into something the designation was no longer fully accurate to describe. The squad that Bardock had built around himself over the years was a reflection of this accumulated experience. Tora, Fascia, Borgos, and Shugesh were not companions by accident or administrative assignment. They were people Bardock had chosen to fight alongside because the experience of many shared missions had established that they could be trusted in the specific limited way that Saiyan culture allowed for trust, which was the trust of knowing how someone would behave in the field when circumstances became dangerous. This was not warmth in the way that other species understood warmth. The Saiyan concept of comradeship was primarily a tactical assessment. You knew your squad mates because you needed to know them, because your life in battle depended on understanding their capabilities and tendencies. And over enough years of shared experience, that knowledge deepened into something that functioned like genuine familiarity. Toro was the member of the squad who was closest to Bardock in terms of the specific quality of their relationship. He had a directness in the way he spoke to Bardock that suggested he felt licensed to say things that someone observing the social hierarchy more carefully might have filtered. He was the one who mentioned Kakarot's birth with the easy familiarity of someone who knew that Bardock's lack of visible sentiment about his newborn son was a performance of cultural expectation, rather than a genuine emotional state. He teased, which was an interesting thing for a Saiyan warrior to do with a superior in the squad dynamic, and the fact that he did it comfortably indicated something about the specific texture of his relationship with Bardock. They had fought together for long enough that the normal distances had been compressed somewhat by familiarity and mutual survival. Fascia occupied a specific role as the only woman in the squad, and the story presented this without commentary or particular emphasis, which was its own kind of statement. She was a warrior of the same essential type as the rest of them, motivated by the same drives, operating within the same framework of conquest and power levels, and the social structure that determined how they lived. She was not soft. The world she inhabited did not reward softness from any direction, and she had clearly not been shaped by that world into anything other than what it intended to produce. She was capable and direct, and her death on Planet Meat was not treated by the story with any greater weight than the deaths of the others, which was the appropriate choice given the world in which she lived, where differentiation by gender was not a feature of the combat culture, the way it might be in other fictional settings. Borgos and Shugesh were somewhat less individually detailed in the special's treatment, but were nonetheless present as real members of the squad rather than simple background figures. They functioned as part of the unit's collective capability, contributing to the overall combat potential that made the squad effective as a team, and rounding out the 5-person structure that allowed them to tackle missions of a certain scope. Their deaths alongside Tora and Fascia on Planet Meat were the event that set Bardock's arc into its final movement, and the fact that all four of them died together rather than individually was part of what gave the scene on Planet Meat its specific weight. It was not a gradual erosion. Bardock returned to find not a survivor who needed help or a wounded comrade who could be recovered. He found what was left after the erasure was complete, and it had been thorough. The mission to planet Canasa that preceded the events on Planet Meat was significant enough that it deserves careful attention, because it was the point at which the story introduced the element that would transform Bardock from a straightforward character into something considerably more complex. Canasa was described in the special as a world inhabited by beings with psychic abilities, a population whose distinguishing quality was their sensitivity to currents of information that existed outside the range of normal physical perception. They were warriors in their own right, capable enough that the conquest of their world required a squad of Bardock's caliber rather than a standard single assignment. And the battle for Canasa was presented as genuine combat rather than a routine clearance operation. The Canasans had a particular relationship with the future that was different in kind from the visions and prophecies that appeared elsewhere in the Dragon Ball universe. It was not a mystical gift in the religious sense. It was presented more as a biological sensitivity, an evolved capacity to perceive certain patterns in the flow of events before those events fully materialized. Whether this capacity was perfectly reliable or simply probabilistic was not something the special fully addressed. What it did address was the consequence of that capacity being transferred to someone for whom it was not a native faculty, someone whose entire life had been built around physical certainty rather than perceptual ambiguity, someone who had no framework for integrating information that arrived through the wrong channel entirely. Tulo was the last surviving Kanasan, and his choice to press this gift into Bardock in his final moments was described as a punishment rather than a gift, which is an important distinction. He was not doing something kind. He was doing something that he believed would cause suffering, that he wanted the conqueror of his people to carry as a mark of what had been taken, that the suffering it caused was of a specific kind, the suffering of seeing terrible things and being unable to prevent them was part of why he considered it a fitting punishment for a member of the species that had just destroyed everything he belonged to. It was poetic in the particular dark way that final acts of defiance sometimes are, shaped by a mind that had thought carefully about what it wanted its last available action to accomplish. The visions that began arriving in Bardock after Canasa were not gentle. They were intrusive and painful, and arrived with a vividness that made the distance between the present moment and the event being shown feel unstable. Bardock was shown things that had not happened yet with the same sensory intensity that the present moment occupied, which created a kind of double exposure in his experience of reality. The actual circumstances he was in overlaid with, or interrupted by images of circumstances he had not yet arrived at. The experience disorientated him in ways that his body's experience of physical wounds had not managed to. He was a person built entirely for the kind of problem that could be solved by punching it hard enough, and the visions were a problem that punching harder did absolutely nothing to address. The images he received in the early days after Canasa were fragmented rather than complete. He saw pieces, not narratives, a face that resembled his own, but younger and wearing a different kind of armor, a world covered in water, a conflict of enormous scale happening at a distance that made the specific details blurry, a brightness at the center of something. These fragments were not yet assembled into a picture he could interpret with confidence, and the pain of receiving them without being able to make meaning from them was its own specific torment. He was being told something, but the message was arriving in a language he did not yet fully speak, and the effort of trying to translate it while simultaneously managing the physical reality of his life added a layer of strain to everything else. Meanwhile, the squad had moved on. The Bardock squad was not a single individual, but a coordinated unit, and their operational calendar did not pause because one member had been sidelined by an unusual experience on the previous mission. Planet Meat was the next assignment, and Tora, Fasha, Borgos, and Shugesh had gone ahead to begin the work. From their perspective, The mission was exactly what it appeared to be, another conquest on a list of conquests, distinguished only by the fact that Bardock was not there to coordinate the team's approach in the way he normally would. They were capable of operating without him, and nothing about the mission's initial parameters suggested that his absence represented any particular risk. What they did not know, what none of them could have known without access to information that existed only within the operational orders of Frieza's inner command structure, was that Frieza had made a decision about the Saiyan race. The decision had been reached through a private calculation that balanced the ongoing utility of Saiyan soldiers against the risk represented by the trajectory their power levels were following, and the calculation had concluded in favor of elimination. The Saiyan race, from the perspective of Frieza's long-term strategic thinking, had transitioned from asset to liability, and the appropriate response to a liability in Frieza's operational framework was removal. The specific mechanism for that removal was still being arranged, but the decision itself was firm, and the preliminary steps were already in motion. The elimination of Bardock's squad was one of those preliminary steps. Frieza's attention had been drawn to Bardock specifically by reports of the Canasa incident, and by the visions that Bardock had been experiencing in the aftermath. Information moved through the Frieza Force's networks in ways that did not always prioritize the privacy of the individual soldiers within it, and the fact that a low-class warrior was reporting unusual psychic experiences connected to the conquest of a psychically gifted population was the kind of detail that, once it reached the appropriate level of Frieza's information hierarchy, became something worth examining closely. Frieza was not interested in having Saiyan warriors developing any kind of prophetic capability. The possibility that Bardock's visions might eventually show him something about what Frieza was planning was a risk that the Emperor saw no reason to tolerate when the alternative was simply having Dodoria's soldiers address the situation on Planet Meat. Dodoria was one of Frieza's two most visible elite soldiers, and he had a reputation within the Frieza Force that was built on thorough violence rather than on elegance or strategy. He was not a subtle instrument. He was a heavy one, and his effectiveness came from a directness that left very little ambiguity about what had happened when he was done with something. The elite soldiers he sent to Planet Meat were selected for the same qualities, people who would do the job completely and leave nothing that required a second visit. The fact that one member of Bardock's squad was found still alive when Bardock arrived was not an intended feature of the operation. Tora's survival, however brief, was the event that Dodoria's planners had not fully accounted for, and it was the piece that changed everything that followed. What happened on Planet Meat, in the quiet period between the ambush and Bardock's arrival, was something that the story trusted the audience to fill in from what they found when Bardock got there. The bodies on the ground told their story efficiently. The squad had been fighting, had been overwhelmed, and had been left in the state that enemies of Frieza typically found themselves in when Dodoria's people were finished with them. Tora was breathing when Bardock arrived, barely, carrying injuries that were not going to be survived for long, and that were severe enough to make the act of speaking a significant effort. He used that effort to tell Bardock what had happened, because he understood that someone needed to know, and Bardock was the person who had come back, when coming back was still possible. Bardock heard the name Dodoria. He heard what that name implied about who had ordered the action. He stood in the wreckage of the thing his professional life had been built around, and he processed information that the Saiyan culture he had grown up in had given him absolutely no framework for processing. Grief as a Saiyan concept was not well developed. The culture did not invest in mourning rituals or extended periods of reflection on loss. Warriors died in battle, and other warriors moved on, because the movement was what the Empire required, and the Empire's requirements had shaped the culture's emotional vocabulary over generations. Bardock was standing in the place where that vocabulary simply ran out, and the absence of the right words for what he was feeling did not mean the feeling was not there. He reached for the armband. Tora's armband, the piece of personal equipment that was soaked with the blood of the person Bardock had been closest to, among the 4 people who had just been taken from him. He wrapped it around his own head, over his hair, and it became the bandana that everyone who would ever think about Bardock in the years ahead would see when they thought about him. It was the gesture of someone who had not yet decided what came next, but who needed to mark, in some physical way, that something had happened here that he intended to carry forward. The bandana was not a declaration. It was not a statement directed at anyone else. It was private, the way the deepest responses to loss are always private, even when they happen in visible form. Still, the bandana became the most recognized element of his design, which is worth sitting with for a moment. In every representation of Bardock across the franchise, across merchandise and video game appearances, and the film adaptations that came decades after the original special, the bandana is there. It is the thing artists reach for first when they want to communicate that the figure they are depicting is Bardock. And it is made of a dead comrade's blood-soaked equipment, the most iconic visual element of a character who became beloved across the Dragon Ball fandom, is also a permanent reminder of what motivated his final hours. A grief marker worn in combat, a memorial that could not be left behind because it had been wrapped directly onto the person carrying it. The return to Planet Frieza 79 was not a strategic choice. Bardock was not approaching the situation from a position of careful planning. He was injured from the events on Canasa, which had not fully resolved before the situation on Planet Meat had added a completely different category of wound. And the state of his body when he arrived back at the Frieza Force staging planet was not the state of a warrior at optimal readiness. He was moving on the combination of adrenaline and grief, and the particular mechanical stubbornness of a person who has decided that doing something is more acceptable than doing nothing, regardless of what the physical calculations say about the odds. The soldiers on Planet Frieza 79 served Frieza. That was enough. They were not individually responsible for what Dodoria's team had done on Planet Meat. They were not personally the targets of Bardock's grief, but they wore the insignia of the force that had arranged for his squad to be destroyed, and that connection was sufficient for the purpose Bardock had arrived with. He fought through the staging area with the specific ferocity that comes from someone who has stopped protecting themselves as a priority, who is absorbing damage that would have made a careful combatant pause and reassess, and instead continuing forward as though the pain were a cost already paid, rather than a signal to be heeded. The visions came during this. They had been building in intensity since Canasa, and the combination of extreme physical and emotional stress seemed to accelerate their arrival, pressing images through his consciousness with greater clarity than the earlier fragments had possessed. He saw the water-covered world again. He saw the figure in orange more distinctly this time, a young man whose face he recognized as his own face, reflected in something younger and without scars. He saw a battle of enormous scale, and at the end of it, something that registered as a conclusion, a specific kind of energy at the resolution of a conflict that his visions were showing him would involve his son and the emperor whose soldiers were surrounding him at this moment. The specificity of what the visions were telling him by this point cannot have been entirely comfortable, because understanding what they were showing required accepting a set of facts about the immediate future that were not pleasant to sit with. If his son was going to fight Frieza, then the situation on Planet Vegeta must be going to become desperate enough that Goku would eventually confront Frieza directly. The path from a baby in a pod to a warrior standing over a defeated emperor was not a short one, and none of the intermediate steps could have been visible in detail. But the destination was becoming clearer with each vision, and the destination implied everything that needed to happen to make it possible. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Frieza's decision to destroy Planet Vegeta was grounded in several overlapping concerns, and the precise weight of each in his final calculation was not something the story was entirely explicit about. The Super Saiyan legend was one factor, a strand of Saiyan cultural mythology that described a warrior of mythological capability who would emerge from the Saiyan bloodline to pose a threat to even the most powerful beings in existence. Frieza had heard versions of this legend and had not dismissed them the way a less perceptive being might have. He had a highly developed instinct for threats, honed by decades of expanding an empire through the systematic elimination of everything that might eventually challenge it. And the Saiyan legend registered on that instinct in a way he was not willing to simply ignore. The second factor was the trajectory of Saiyan power levels as a whole. Frieza tracked these carefully enough to notice the curve they were following, the steady upward climb driven by the Zenkai system, and the accumulated combat experience of a population that did nothing but fight. The individual warriors of the current generation posed no direct challenge to him, and he was confident of that. But a generation ahead, or 2 or 3 if the trajectory continued without interruption, the mathematics of Saiyan biology would produce something that might require more of his attention than he was interested in allocating to it. The simplest and most complete solution to a threat that had not yet fully materialized was to prevent the materialization rather than to wait and respond to it. The third factor was more personal and less strategic, which was that Frieza simply did not like the feeling of a species existing under his authority that contained within itself the potential to eventually exceed him. He had built his position on being the most powerful individual in the universe, and the psychological weight of that position depended on it remaining true. The Saiyan race was the only population in his empire whose internal mechanism pointed, over sufficient time, in the direction of that position being challenged. He was not accustomed to threats, and was not particularly interested in becoming accustomed to them. The supernova was, in this reading, as much an act of psychological management as it was a strategic decision. Zarbon was the other of Frieza's 2 most prominent elite soldiers, and alongside Dodoria he represented the particular aesthetic of Frieza's court. Power dressed in elegance and cruelty, worn lightly as though it were a matter of personal style. Where Dodoria was blunt and heavy and obvious in his methods, Garban presented himself with a deliberate grace that made the violence he was capable of feel more calculated. Both of them served Frieza with a specific loyalty of people who understood that their positions depended entirely on being useful to someone whose power vastly exceeded their own. And both of them observed the events of Bardock's final charge with the particular expression of those who are watching something that confirms what they already knew about the relationship between individual courage and institutional power. What they could not have fully anticipated as they watched Bardock press through the army of Frieza's soldiers above Planet Vegeta was that the sight of it would eventually say something to them about their own situation. Bardock, in his final moments of speaking before Frieza, said things about Saiyans and about what they were capable of that were not specifically directed at Carbon and Doria, but that landed in the vicinity of something true about anyone who served Frieza. The Emperor's willingness to eliminate an entire race for the crime of being potentially dangerous in the future was information that, properly processed, implied something about the security of every person in Frieza's immediate service. The soldiers who died alongside Bardock in the supernova, the ones Frieza had directed to fight in defense of his ship a moment before the supernova consumed everything in the vicinity, were replaceable to Frieza as well. They always had been. That was the nature of serving someone for whom power was the only currency that had real value. Bardock had not specifically planned to communicate any of this. His charge toward Frieza's ship was not a lecture. It was a response, the only available one, driven by grief and the particular certainty that the visions had given him about how events were moving. He was not trying to demonstrate anything to observers. He was trying to reach Frieza because reaching Frieza was the only remaining action that the situation offered. And reaching him was better than not reaching him, even if the outcome of reaching him was already visible from a considerable distance to anyone watching with clear eyes. The specific nature of the attack Bardock launched at Frieza when he finally arrived within range has been noted by fans who have thought carefully about the imagery. A concentrated ball of energy, blue and compact, aimed directly at the Emperor, who sat composed and unmoved in his chair. The color and the form of it have been compared to certain other significant visual elements in the Dragon Ball universe, and whether the connection was intentional or simply the product of consistent visual design is a question the production itself did not answer. What the attack represented in terms of everything Bardock had left was clear enough without that additional layer, which was the complete output of a 10,000 power level warrior's ability to generate force directed at someone whose capability to absorb or redirect that force was orders of magnitude greater. Frieza's response was not hurried. He had been preparing the supernova for some time before Bardock arrived, gathering energy at a scale that individual combat did not typically require, and the arrival of a single low-class Saiyan on the threshold of his ship did not alter the timeline he had been working within. He allowed the energy to continue gathering, allowed Bardock to speak, allowed the situation to develop at its own pace, because the outcome was settled and the pace was therefore entirely his to set. He released the supernova with the quality of someone completing a prepared action rather than responding urgently to a threat, which communicated something precise about the discrepancy between what Bardock represented and what Frieza was. The supernova was enormous. The energy it contained was not in the category of things that were usefully measured in the same units as individual warriors' power levels. It was a sphere of concentrated destruction large enough to consume a planet on its own, and it was moving through the space between Frieza's ship and Planet Vegeta with the specific quality of something that has been precisely aimed rather than simply released. Bardock's attack did not alter its course. His attack was absorbed by the supernova the way a small wave is absorbed by a much larger one, without resistance, without drama, without even the acknowledgement of a struggle. One thing simply became part of another thing, and the larger thing continued on its path. The moments available to Bardock as the supernova reached and began to envelope him were, in narrative terms, among the most carefully used in the entire special. He was caught in the expanding energy which was moving at the speed and scale of something terminal, and the situation was not leaving room for decisions or last actions. There was space for a moment, perhaps two, and the story used that space for the final vision. It arrived with the clarity that all the previous visions had been building toward, the image assembled from all the fragmented pieces that had been arriving since Canasa, now complete and sharp and unambiguous. He saw his son standing on the water-covered world, in circumstances that could only mean that the fight the visions had been showing him in pieces was resolved, that the outcome was the one the visions had been pointing toward, that Frieza had faced Kakarot and lost. The smile came from that. It is important to be precise about where the smile came from, because precision matters for understanding what it meant. It was not happiness. It was not satisfaction in any comprehensive sense. It was not the comfortable feeling of a person whose life had gone well, arriving at a peaceful ending. Bardock had just been erased from the universe by an emperor he could not touch, in the process of failing to save any of the people he had been trying to warn, and nothing about the circumstances that surrounded the smile was good. What the smile was responding to was the specific narrow piece of information the vision had provided, which was that the failure was not final. The story was not ending here. It was transferring. The thing he had tried to do and could not do was going to be done by someone else, in a different form, on a distant world he had never seen. That is a particular kind of consolation, limited and hard-edged, and not at all the same as the thing it was substituting for, but real in its own terms. He was being taken by the same force that had taken his squad and was about to take his planet, and the only thing he had that was not being taken was the knowledge the vision had given him. He held that. He smiled. The energy completed its work. Planet Vegeta ceased to exist. The supernova's impact was total and without remainder, the kind of destruction that left no wreckage significant enough to be called the remains of anything. A civilization that had existed on that surface across many generations, a caste system that had organized the lives of everyone born into it, for as long as anyone in that civilization could remember. A culture built entirely around force and rank and the relentless accumulation of battle experience, all of it simply stopped. The red sky and the rocky ground and the buildings and the equipment and the vast majority of the Saiyan race, from the lowest ranked foot soldiers to the highest born elite warriors, were consumed in a single event that lasted from the perspective of an outside observer for a very brief time. Frieza watched it from his ship and found it beautiful, which was a detail that required no additional commentary to communicate exactly what it said about him. He had just destroyed a civilization. He had done it deliberately, with preparation and forethought, for reasons that served his interests. He watched the destruction, and his response to it was aesthetic appreciation. There is no better single detail in the entire special for communicating the specific quality of Frieza's character. The capacity for violence at civilizational scale, combined with the particular coldness of finding that violence pleasant to observe. A handful of Saiyan warriors survived the destruction of Planet Vegeta purely because they were not on the planet when it happened. Raditz, Bardock's older son, was on a mission elsewhere. Vegeta and Nappa were likewise engaged in operations that placed them away from the planet during the moments of its destruction. These survivors did not survive because they were warned or protected or special in any way that the Empire recognized. They survived because their operational assignments happened to place them at a sufficient distance from the event when it occurred, which was the specific kind of survival that the Dragon Ball universe describes sometimes as luck and sometimes as the universe's way of preserving the pieces it still needs for what comes next. Raditz would eventually find his way to Earth years later, following the trail of a planetary conquest mission that had been assigned to Kakarot before the destruction of Planet Vegeta had made the mission's original purpose impossible. He arrived on Earth looking for his younger brother, and what he found was someone who did not recognize him, who had grown up with no knowledge of the Saiyan race, who had been shaped entirely by the life Earth had provided, rather than by anything the civilization Raditz came from had built. The conversation between Raditz and the person who had grown up as Goku was the moment at which the Dragon Ball Z series introduced the Saiyan backstory into the main narrative. And it was also the moment at which Goku received for the first time the basic facts of who he was and where he had come from. Goku learned in that encounter that he was a Saiyan. He learned that his purpose in being sent to Earth had been to conquer it. He learned that his grandfather had not died by accident, but had been killed by Goku himself during a full moon transformation that Goku had no memory of. He learned that his name was Kakarot, and that his father had been a low-class warrior, and that the civilization he had come from had been destroyed by the same Frieza who would later become the central antagonist of the arc that the entire Saiyan saga was building toward. This was a considerable amount of information to receive in a short period, delivered by someone who had arrived as an enemy rather than as a gentle messenger, and Goku's response to it was characteristic, which was to receive it and then to set it aside and respond to the immediate situation, rather than to spend extended time processing the implications. The Saiyan backstory that Dragon Ball Z introduced through Raditz's arrival and then expanded through Vegeta and Nappa's subsequent appearance established a context for the franchise that permanently changed the scale of what it was doing. Dragon Ball had been, in its original form, a martial arts adventure story with fantastical elements built around tournament competitions and quests, and the specific dynamic of a child growing up and becoming stronger through training and competition. Dragon Ball Z expanded that into something with cosmic scope, a story that reached backward in time to extinct civilizations and forward in time to conflicts that involved planetary destruction and universal stakes. Bardock's story, told in the special that aired during this expanded context, was the piece that gave all of that scope a specific emotional anchor, a point of origin that was human adjacent in its grief and its failure and its small final consolation. In time, the franchise would return to Bardock through a very different kind of story. Many years after the original special, Akira Toriyama wrote a short manga chapter called Dragon Ball Minus. This chapter was included as a bonus in a volume of the Dragon Ball Super manga and served as a prequel story covering the period immediately before the destruction of Planet Vegeta. Specifically, the decision to send the infant Kakarot away from the doomed planet, the Bardock of Dragon Ball Minus was somewhat different in characterization from the one established in the original special, not contradictory in any fundamental way, but differently emphasized, with qualities that the special had not highlighted and a context that had changed in one significant respect. That significant respect was Gin. She was introduced in Dragon Ball Minus as Bardock's mate, the mother of Raditz and Kakarot, and her introduction added a dimension to Bardock's story that had previously been entirely absent. Jin was unusual among Saiyans. She had a gentleness that her culture had not managed to extinguish, a warmth that coexisted with her status as a warrior without resolving the tension between those two things into one or the other. She and Bardock had been partners for long enough that the relationship between them had taken on a quality of genuine care that was not typical of Saiyan social arrangements, which tended toward the more transactional than the invested. Her presence in the origin story changed the reason Kakarot was sent away. In the original special's framing, the reason Kakarot was in a pod heading for Earth was essentially administrative, a mission assignment for a low-class warrior directed at a low-resistance planet. In Dragon Ball Minus's framing, the reason was that Bardock had learned enough about what Frieza was planning to know that getting their son off the planet was the most useful thing they could do with the remaining time. He and Gine made the decision together, with the specific combination of practicality and parental feeling that the character of Jean introduced into the dynamic. They did not have time for an extended farewell. The pod departed, and the planet was destroyed, and Kakarot flew toward a life that neither of his parents would live to know the outcome of. The Dragon Ball Super Broly film incorporated the Dragon Ball Minus material into its opening sequence and gave it the full treatment of theatrical animation, with voice performances and visual quality that brought the characters to life in a way that the manga chapter had not been able to provide. The film's opening was quiet and deliberately paced, asking the audience to sit with Bardock and Jin in what both characters understood were their final days on a planet whose destruction they had accepted as inevitable. The Bardock of that opening was softer than the Bardock of the original special in specific ways that the two contexts required. A man saying goodbye to a child he is sending toward an uncertain future on a distant planet, rather than a warrior charging alone toward an emperor, called for a different quality of presence. The question of how these two versions of Bardock relate to each other is one that Dragon Ball fans have thought about from multiple angles. They are not entirely reconcilable on every specific point, and the production history of the franchise meant that the second version was created with full awareness of the first, making choices about where to depart from the original special's characterization, deliberately rather than accidentally. What they shared was the most important structural element, which was that Bardock was a low-class warrior who cared enough about his son to act in his son's favor even when that action was expensive, and that the civilization that had shaped him was destroyed before either of them could see what the action eventually produced. Toriyama's specific reaction to the original Bardock special was documented through the Daisen-shu reference volumes, which collected interviews and commentary from the creators and collaborators. His statement about the special was not a brief or dismissive acknowledgement. He described it in terms that suggested he had thought about it carefully and found in it qualities that impressed him precisely because they were different from his own instincts as a storyteller. He noted that it was the kind of story he himself would not have written, which he framed explicitly as a compliment, as a recognition that the production team had taken his universe and found within it a story that existed beyond the edges of where his own creative thinking naturally went. This was the specific generosity of an artist who could appreciate an approach fundamentally different from his own without needing to subsume it into his own preferences. The formal canonization of Bardock followed from that appreciation. When Toriyama incorporated Bardock into the original manga run of Dragon Ball, he was doing something that creators of transmedia franchises do not always do, which was legitimizing an addition made by a collaborating production team by including it in the primary text that all other versions of the story were built from. Bardock appeared in the manga, which meant that the character who had originated in Toei Animation's production team now had standing in the source material itself. The anime-only character had been adopted into the canon by the creator of the universe, and that adoption was what eventually allowed Toriyama to build further on the character in Dragon Ball Minus and in his contributions to the Broly film. The character design that Toriyama settled on for Bardock had specific qualities worth examining in detail. The scar along the cheek was a marker of survived violence, the kind of mark that accumulates on someone who has been in enough combat to have close calls visible on their body. The green armor was functional and worn, the equipment of a soldier who used their gear rather than displaying it, a visual contrast with the more elaborate and ceremonial equipment associated with elite Saiyan warriors and with Frieza's personal court. The bandana, In the canonical version, rather than the original Nakatsuru design, was the element Toriyama retained from the special story rather than from any prior visual concept, and the choice to keep it represented an acknowledgement that the story had earned that image its place in the character's identity. The hair was the most discussed alteration from Nakatsuru's original design. The change to make Bardock's hair resemble Goku's was a deliberate narrative choice rather than a purely aesthetic one. Toriyama wanted the resemblance to be unmistakable, wanted the audience's first sight of Bardock to carry with it the specific effect of seeing a familiar face in an unfamiliar context. Nakatsuru's design had been good, had served the character well in its original form, and the fact that Toriyama changed it was not a rejection but a refinement, an adjustment toward the specific effect the story needed from the visual relationship between father and son. The face that Dragon Ball audiences had been watching for years appeared in a context of conquest and violence, and the displacement between the familiar face and the unfamiliar context was precisely what the special was asking its audience to sit with. The voice performance that Masako Nozawa delivered for Bardock is one of the more quietly remarkable achievements in the special's production, because it required her to use the same fundamental vocal apparatus that had become associated with Goku's specific qualities, his earnestness and warmth, and the particular quality of his emotional directness, to communicate a completely different person. Bardock was not Goku. He was rougher, more aggressive, less patient, more wounded in the specific way of someone who has lived a harder and less protected life. The performance Nozawa gave for him moved in the same vocal register that Goku occupied, but inhabited it differently, creating a father who sounded like his son without actually sounding like him, which is precisely the effect a well-executed family resemblance and performance produces. This casting decision added its own layer to every scene in the special, operating below the level of conscious attention for viewers who were simply watching the story, and above it for viewers who were listening with the specific awareness of what they were hearing. When Bardock spoke, the voice carried a memory of Goku. When the visions arrived and Bardock saw Kakarot on the water-covered world, the image of a son who would face Frieza was doubled by the sound of a voice that would eventually belong to both of them, the father's and the son's voices occupying the same body of sound the way their faces occupied the same shape in the visual design. The English language version of the special handled this differently by necessity, since Funimation's casting for Goku and Bardock used different actors. Sonny Strait was assigned the role of Bardock and brought his own reading of the character to a version of the special that was reaching an audience who might have no awareness of the Japanese production's choices. The performance delivered in that context has its specific merits, working within the particular vocal expectations that the Funimation dub had established for the Dragon Ball universe without the specific resonance that the original Japanese casting created through the shared voice. Both versions of the special have found their audiences and produced their emotional responses. They are different experiences that cover the same story, and the differences between them are themselves informative about the range of what that story can carry. The music composed for and used in the Bardock special deserves extended consideration because it does something that the best scores for dramatic productions do, which is to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. On its most immediate level, it drove the energy of action sequences and supported the emotional register of quieter scenes in the ways that any effective film score does. On a secondary level, the specific piece associated with the battle sequences, a song called Solid State Scouter, was doing something considerably more specific that rewarded close attention. The lyrics of Solid State Scouter, as they appear in the original Japanese, count upward through numbers. The song was not simply providing an energetic musical backdrop to combat. It was, underneath the surface, reciting power levels. The specific power levels it was reciting belonged to the figures relevant to the Frieza force's hierarchy, climbing from numbers associated with mid-level soldiers through the figures that represented Frieza's elite, before arriving at the 530,000 that the scouter readings of the era attributed to Frieza's first form. The song, in other words, was counting toward the force of Bardock's destruction. Every sequence it accompanied was backed by a musical piece whose hidden lyrical content was building toward the specific number that represented the power that would kill everyone it was celebrating. This was not something most viewers would consciously register in real time. It was the kind of detail that operated on a frequency below active awareness, contributing to a feeling without announcing the reason for the feeling. But for viewers who learned about it afterward and returned to the special with that knowledge, the song transformed from a good piece of battle music into something that functioned more like dark poetry, a piece of the story's design that acknowledged the futility of everything it was scoring before the story itself reached that acknowledgement. The music had been telling the ending from the first moment it played. The production timeline of the Bardock special placed it at a specific juncture in the Dragon Ball franchise's history that amplified the effect of its story in particular ways. The Dragon Ball Z anime was in full operation by the time of the October 17th broadcast. The Frieza arc was the ongoing narrative in the anime, which meant that the audience watching the Bardock special was watching it while simultaneously consuming or having just consumed the story of Frieza's defeat. They knew Goku had become a Super Saiyan on Namek. They knew Frieza had been defeated. They knew the outcome that Bardock's final visions had shown him. The distance between what Bardock saw in his last moments and what the audience already knew had happened was zero. There was no dramatic irony in the traditional sense, where the audience knows something the character does not. The audience and Bardock arrived at the same knowledge at the same moment, but from opposite directions. He arrived at it at the end, and they arrived at it at the beginning. And the emotional effect of that convergence was one of the things that made the special work as powerfully as it did. The legacy of the Bardock special in the Dragon Ball fandom is built on several things that are worth naming individually. First, there is the quality of the story itself, which managed to do something unusual in the franchise's catalog, which was to tell a tragic story without resolution within its own runtime, a story that could only fully close by pointing outward to a future it would not show. Second, there is the specific design of the character, which achieved the kind of visual distinctiveness that makes a character immediately recognizable across decades and across very different contexts, from animated specials to theatrical films to video games. Third, there is the emotional accessibility of Bardock's specific kind of failure, which is the kind that most people have some relationship to. The failure of seeing something clearly and not being able to make anyone else see it. Of knowing a thing and being unable to act on that knowledge in a way that changes the outcome. That last point is perhaps the one that explains the depth of the connection audiences have maintained with Bardock across the years since his original appearance. He was not a hero in the traditional Dragon Ball sense. He did not win. He did not grow beyond his limitations in a way that allowed him to meet the challenge that destroyed him. He charged at something too large for him and was erased by it. And the only consolation available to him was a vision of someone else doing the thing he could not do. The story did not offer him a transformation, did not give him a power-up that closed the gap between his ability and what was required. It was simply honest about the fact that some forces are too large for a given individual to move, and that this is not a failure of will, but simply a fact about scale. That honesty is rare enough in action fiction that it registered with the people who encountered it and continued to register across the decades, producing the specific kind of loyalty that audiences give to stories that do not flinch from the things that action fiction typically flinches from. Bardock lost. He lost completely, without a redemption that restored anything he had lost, without a victory that made the loss worthwhile in retrospect. The only thing he was given in exchange was knowledge, and the story treated that as enough, because it was what was available, and sometimes what is available is what you carry. The broader thematic architecture of Bardock's story connects to the central dynamics of the Frieza saga in ways that reward the kind of attention that slow, careful viewing allows for. The Frieza saga is, at its core, a story about what happens when power at a certain scale decides that it can simply eliminate whatever it finds inconvenient. Frieza represents that power in its most concentrated form, unencumbered by sentiment or ideology or any constraint other than his own preferences. The Saiyan race's destruction was, from his perspective, a trivial administrative action, the kind of thing that an empire of his scope needs to perform occasionally to manage its risk profile. He watched his supernova consume a planet and found it beautiful because to him it was not a civilization ending, it was a problem being resolved. Bardock, in this architecture, represents something specific and necessary. He is the story's way of refusing to let the destruction of Planet Vegeta remain administrative. He is the perspective from inside the thing being eliminated, the person who makes the scale of the loss legible by living it rather than observing it from orbit. Every time the Dragon Ball franchise has acknowledged what happened to the Saiyan race, it has been working with the emotional material that the Bardock special deposited into the franchise's collective memory, the specific quality of feeling that comes from a story told from the inside of a tragedy rather than from the outside looking in. The Saiyan civilization that Bardock belonged to was not a sympathetic one by most available ethical standards. It conquered planets and destroyed civilizations with professional detachment, and called this work. It organized its people into a hierarchy that used a birth measurement to determine their worth for the entirety of their lives. It produced warriors who participated in these activities without meaningful moral reservation, and who raised children in a culture that systematically removed the capacity for that kind of reflection. Bardock himself, before the events of the special, was fully embedded in this system, was a product of it, was doing exactly what it trained him to do. He was not a person who had been quietly resisting the violence of his culture. He was the violence pointed at planets and activated. The special does not pretend this is not the case. It shows Bardock in his Uzaru form, destroying a civilization in its opening sequence, and it does not soften that image with any framing that would allow the audience to dismiss it as something other than what it was. The Saiyan race did terrible things, and Bardock was a member of the Saiyan race who participated in those things, and the tragedy of what Frieza did to them did not erase or excuse what they had done to others. The story held both of those things at once, which is a more sophisticated moral position than action fiction often manages, and it produced a character who could be mourned and appreciated without being simply idealized. What changed Bardock was not a moral awakening in the traditional sense. He was not redeemed through the experience of empathy with the civilizations his race had been destroying. He was changed by grief, specifically by the grief of losing the people closest to him, to a force that operated by the same logic his civilization had always operated by, just applied from a higher level of the hierarchy. He understood what had been done to his squad because he had done equivalent things himself, and the understanding did not arrive accompanied by any broader recognition of what all those equivalent things had meant to the people on the other side of them. It arrived as pure loss, unmediated by philosophy, and what it produced was not wisdom, but fury directed at the specific source of the specific loss. That fury was not heroic in the traditional sense, but it was real, and the story treated its realness with the respect that real things deserve. Bardock charged at Frieza not because he had become good, but because grief had pointed him in a direction, and he was a person who had spent his whole life moving in the direction he was pointed. The culture that made him useful to Frieza was the same culture that made his final charge possible, which is its own kind of irony, the tools that build a thing sometimes being the tools used to dismantle it. The connection between Bardock and Goku, across the distance of a story told in fragments and visions, is ultimately about the inheritance that operates below the level of information. Goku did not know about Bardock. He did not grow up with the story of his father's final charge. He could not use Bardock's example in any direct sense, could not draw on a tradition or a memory that he had never been given access to. What he inherited from Bardock was not a narrative but a biology and an origin, the starting point of a life that he then built entirely from the materials Earth provided. The person he became had no direct relationship to the person Bardock was, because the relationship was severed at the pod. And yet the story found a way to make the connection legible anyway through the vision. Bardock saw Goku's triumph before Goku had any idea what the word triumph would mean in his own life. The connection ran backward from the future into the past, visible from one end only, and the end from which it was visible was the one that needed it more. Goku did not need to know about Bardock to defeat Frieza. Bardock needed to know about Goku to die with something other than pure loss. The vision was the gift that Tulo's curse eventually produced. Not a warning that prevented anything, not a weapon that changed the outcome, but a window through which a man in his final moments could see that the person most worth caring about was going to be all right. In its own quiet way, that is the most generous thing the Dragon Ball universe ever did for one of its characters. It did not save him. It did not vindicate him in any public sense. It did not give him the victory he had charged toward. It gave him a window, that was all. And the story decided that a window, at the right moment, was enough. The Bardock special, from its October broadcast in 1990 to the decades of engagement it has generated since, demonstrated something about what the Dragon Ball universe was capable of when it chose to use the world Toriyama had built for a story that moved at a different pace and toward different ends than the main series. It proved that the franchise contained within it the emotional range to tell a tragedy with honesty, to create a character who failed, and to let that failure be the point rather than a setup for an eventual success. To invite the audience to care about someone whose story was already over before the audience arrived, knowing that the overness of it was part of what made caring worthwhile. Bardock did not get a second chance. He did not get a transformation that closed the gap. He got 10,000 units of power and a bloody bandana and visions that arrived too late to do the thing he wanted them to do. And in the last available moment, he got a single clear image of his son on a world he would never see. And he chose to let that image be enough. The universe did not give him more than that. He took what he had and he moved toward what he could not survive moving toward. And the story remembered him for it. That is, in the end, the fact about Bardock that matters most. Not the power level, not the squad, not the visions or the charge, or even the smile. The fact that matters most is that the story took a low-class warrior from the bottom of a brutal hierarchy, gave him exactly as much as the universe was prepared to give him, and then asked him to find in that amount something worth moving forward for. He found it. He moved forward. The universe did the rest. Thanks for spending this time in the Dragon Ball universe with me. If you'd like to keep drifting, another video is ready on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you close your eyes. Sleep might find you before the next story finishes. There is something to be said about the specific texture of Planet Vegeta, as the Dragon Ball universe described it across multiple sources, because the world itself was not simply a backdrop, but an active contributor to the kind of story the Bardock special was telling. The planet was described in the Dai Senshu reference materials, significantly stronger than the gravitational pull of Earth, and the effect of growing up under that increased gravity was one of the factors that contributed to the baseline physical capability of the Saiyan race. Every Saiyan body that developed under Planet Vegeta's gravitational demands was, by the time it reached physical maturity, already stronger than a comparable body developed under lighter gravitational conditions. This was one of the things that made Saiyans effective soldiers from the beginning of their careers, rather than requiring the extended training periods that warriors from lower gravity worlds might need. The society that had developed on this world organized itself around the qualities that the world rewarded, which meant that physical power was the central currency of Saiyan social life in a way that was even more thoroughgoing than the structure of most militarized civilizations. Other warrior cultures have often maintained parallel systems for valuing cleverness or loyalty or the specific kind of endurance that has nothing to do with physical strength. The Saiyan caste system, as the Dragon Ball universe described it, had not developed significant parallel tracks. Power was the thing, and rank was the thing, and the two were understood to be related in ways that made the overall system feel more inevitable than it actually was. A person born with higher power was ranked higher, and their higher rank gave them access to experiences that produced more power, which reinforced the apparent naturalness of the arrangement. The full moon was one of the most distinctive elements of Saiyan capability, tied to the Uzaru transformation that allowed Saiyans to multiply their already considerable power by a factor of 10 when exposed to the specific wavelength of light reflected from a full natural satellite. The great ape form was not subtle. It was enormous, destructive, and difficult to control for warriors who had not specifically trained to maintain their consciousness through the transformation. The opening sequence of the Bardock special showed Bardock in this form, and the deliberate choice to introduce him through his Uzaru transformation rather than through his humanoid form was a specific narrative decision about what the story wanted the audience's first encounter with him to feel like. Seeing the great ape first, the enormous destructive shape against the backdrop of a full moon and a planet being conquered, and then cutting to the face of a man who looked like Goku as the creature that had just been visible, was the kind of visual transition that landing differently depending on what the audience carried with them into the moment. For an audience who knew Goku well, who had been watching him be essentially good for years, seeing his face emerge from the context of that destruction created a specific kind of productive discomfort. This was not Goku. This was someone who inhabited the same face but lived in an entirely different moral atmosphere, and the transition made that difference legible in a single cut. The Uzaru form also connected Bardock to the broader history of the Saiyan race in a way that grounded his story in the physical world of Dragon Ball's cosmology. The transformation required a full moon, which meant that it was both powerful and dependent on a specific environmental condition, tying the Saiyan race's greatest individual power surge to something external and periodic. Frieza was eventually shown in the broader Dragon Ball Z timeline to have been aware of this feature of Saiyan biology and to have taken it into account in his calculations about the race's threat potential. The ability that made Saiyans so formidable under the right conditions was also a fixed feature of their biology that an enemy who understood it could account for. This was part of the broader picture of Frieza's relationship with the Saiyans, which was one of using them fully while also understanding them completely enough to know exactly how to eliminate them when the time came. The specific culture around great conquests in Saiyan society had a celebratory quality that the Bardock special captured in the opening sequence in a way that was deliberately uncritical. The squad resting after the battle, the sense of shared accomplishment in the wake of a successful planetary conquest, the casual tone with which they discussed it, all of this was presented without commentary. There was no camera language that signaled disapproval, no musical cue that indicated tragedy, no character in the frame who seemed troubled by what had just happened. The Saiyan culture was being shown from the inside, as it felt to the people inhabiting it, which meant that the destruction of a civilization by the squad was presented with the same emotional neutrality that finishing a workday presents to people for whom the work is ordinary. This was a difficult choice and a correct one, because it established the baseline from which Bardock's eventual emotional transformation could be measured. If the opening had indicated that the conquest was wrong, had provided some framing that suggested the audience should be troubled by what they were watching, it would have suggested a pre-existing moral sensitivity in the Saiyan characters that the story then did not need to develop. By presenting the conquest as genuinely ordinary from the perspective of the participants, the story preserved the full distance between where Bardock started and where grief eventually took him, which made the journey more honest and the endpoint more meaningful. There is a detail about the Canasa mission that is worth attending to more carefully than a first viewing might prompt, which is the specific nature of what Tulo did when he pressed the gift of foresight into Bardock. He did not give Bardock a clear, navigable window into the future. He gave him something closer to uncontrolled access to a perceptual range that his brain was not built to process comfortably. And the distinction matters for understanding why the visions functioned as a curse rather than as a straightforward advantage. Bardock received information, but he received it without the context and interpretive framework that the Canasans had presumably developed over generations of living with this ability. He was getting the data without the training, the signal without the tuning, and the result was the specific combination of pain and confusion and partial understanding that characterized his experience of the visions throughout the special. A psychic ability developed by a species over generations is presumably calibrated to that species' cognitive architecture, to the specific ways their minds process and store and retrieve information. Pressing it into a Saiyan warrior whose mental architecture had been shaped by entirely different pressures across entirely different generations, was not going to produce the clean, legible foreknowledge that a native Canasa might have accessed. It was going to produce something rougher and more disorienting, a faculty operating through equipment it was not designed for. And that is precisely what the special showed. Bardock's visions were fragments rather than complete images, physically painful rather than peacefully informative, arriving at inconvenient moments rather than when sought. This was not a gift conveniently shaped for his use. It was a complication that the story let be a complication. The meaning of those fragments evolved as the special progressed, and part of what made the pacing of the special effective was the way this evolution tracked alongside the progression of the main plot. Early visions were barely interpretable, shapes and colors and a sense of something large rather than any specific image. Later visions gained detail and specificity as the emotional stakes of Bardock's situation intensified. The final vision, the clearest and most complete of all of them, arrived at the moment of maximum desperation, which is the kind of structural symmetry that good storytelling builds toward without announcing. The visions grew clearest when they were needed most, not because the ability was responding to his need, but because the story had been building toward that clarity and delivered it at the moment where it would have the most effect. The visual language of the visions themselves was worth noting. They were rendered in the special with a softer and slightly hazier quality than the primary footage, a visual distinction that marked them as belonging to a different order of reality than the main events. This was a simple and effective production choice that did two things when they were watching the vision and communicating something about the nature of the vision itself, which was that it existed at a slight remove from the solid present. The haziness suggested the interpretation rather than the capture, the mind's attempt to represent something it could not fully hold, rather than a direct recording of something observed. The timeline of events between Canasa and Planet Vegeta's destruction is relatively compressed in terms of in-universe time, and that compression contributed to the specific emotional texture of Bardock's final days. There was not a long period available for him to sit with what had happened, to process the loss of his squad at any thoughtful pace, to develop a considered strategy for what came next. The events pressed against each other with a tightness that left no space for the kind of reflection that might have produced a different outcome. He recovered from Canasa. The squad was on Planet Meat. He was back. He found them dead. He fought through Planet Frieza 17-9. He tried to warn the Saiyans, and all of this happened within a window that felt pressured by a sense that the larger events had their own timeline independent of what Bardock needed to be ready for it. That pressure was itself a feature of the story's design. The special was not structured to give Bardock comfortable pacing. The events pushed him forward without adequate preparation time at each stage, and the accumulation of that pressure was part of what made his final charge feel like the only option remaining rather than a choice among several. By the time he launched himself upward toward Frieza's ship, the story had closed all the other doors in a way that made the charge feel less like a decision and more like what happens when there is nothing else to do and a person is not built for standing still. The specific geography of what lay between Bardock and Frieza's ship was a space populated by soldiers who were told to hold the line against a single low-class Saiyan whose power level, for all his accumulated Zenkai boosts, was still measurably insufficient to the task he was attempting. From a purely tactical standpoint, the assignment should have been manageable. A warrior of 10,000 facing organized resistance from soldiers who, in aggregate, represented a multiple of that power should not have been able to cut through in the way that Bardock did. What the purely tactical standpoint missed was that Bardock was not fighting according to the logic of tactical advantage. He was fighting according to the logic of grief and forward momentum. And those are not quantities that aggregate military power is well designed to account for. The soldiers he was fighting were doing their jobs. They were not particularly afraid of him in any way that their training would have told them to be. A 10,000 power level warrior was formidable by most available standards, but not by Frieza Force standards, not in an organized defense of an emperor's flagship. They had numbers and position and the institutional confidence of being on the side of the unquestioned winner. What they did not have was any framework for engaging with someone who had stopped caring about the conditions under which they would stop him, who was absorbing damage that would have stopped most combatants without slowing down, who was treating each wound as a simple cost rather than a signal to reassess. The special's depiction of soldiers reaching out to grab him and drag him back, and Bardock continuing to push forward through the grasping hands, was a precise image of what happens when pure physical advantage meets a will that has disengaged from physical self-preservation as a priority. There are questions in Dragon Ball fandom about the specific content of what Bardock said to Frieza when he reached the point of being within speaking distance of the Emperor, and the special treated this moment with a particular kind of restraint that prevented it from becoming a speech in the traditional dramatic sense. Bardock spoke. Frieza allowed him to speak, which was its own communication about the regard in which he held what Bardock was saying. He received the words without responding to them, without engaging with their content in any way that would have elevated the exchange to the level of a real conversation. He did not rebut. He did not acknowledge. He simply demonstrated, through the sustained quality of his indifference, that Bardock's words were landing in a space that had no mechanism for registering their arrival. This was perhaps the most devastating thing Frieza could have done to Bardock in that moment, which was to treat him as though he were simply not worth engaging with. He had charged alone through an army. He had survived damage that should have stopped him. He had arrived at this point on the basis of everything he had available to spend, and the Emperor, who had ordered the destruction of his squad and was in the process of ordering the destruction of his planet, was not going to deign to explain himself or respond to what Bardock had come to say. The silence was the answer. And the answer was that the question did not matter, because Bardock did not matter, because the entire Saiyan race that Bardock was representing in that moment did not matter. And Frieza's silence was his way of saying that cleanly. The Dragon Ball Super series, which began airing in 2015 and represented a continuation of the franchise set after the defeat of Majin Buu, returned to the history of the Saiyan race on several occasions in ways that built on what the Bardock special had established. The Tournament of Power, the central event of Dragon Ball Super's final arc, brought together warriors from multiple universes, and in doing so raised questions about what it meant for a warrior's heritage and origins to connect to their current capabilities. Goku's Saiyan origin was referenced in the context of his drive to become stronger, with the series explicitly connecting his relentless push toward greater power to the Saiyan biological impulse toward growth through challenge that the Zenkai system embodied. The God Ki transformations that Dragon Ball Super introduced added new dimensions to the discussion of Saiyan power that the franchise had been conducting since the original series, and while none of them directly revisited Bardock's story, they operated within a framework that Bardock's story had helped establish, which was the framework of understanding Saiyan power as something with deep roots that expressed itself differently across generations and circumstances. The Super Saiyan God transformation, in particular, was connected in its lore to an ancient Saiyan legend about a warrior of immense power achieved through a ritual connection among Saiyans. And the fact that such a legend existed in Saiyan history, possibly predating the Empire era, suggested a layer of Saiyan culture that the Bardock special had only gestured at. In Dragon Ball GT, which represented the continuation of the Dragon Ball Z story before Super was produced, and which occupied a complicated position in the franchise's canonical status, Bardock was not featured significantly. The series had other concerns and was operating in a timeframe far removed from the events of the Bardock special, dealing with a version of Goku and a world that had moved well past the Frieza arc's concerns. But the foundational backstory that the Bardock special had established remained present in the background of everything GT was doing, a piece of the franchise's accumulated history that informed the context even when it was not being directly addressed. The Bardock special's position within the Dragon Ball franchise's catalog of productions is unusual in a way that speaks to how much ground a single well-executed story can cover. It was not a long production. Its runtime was under an hour. It covered a limited span of narrative time and a relatively small cast of characters, and yet it managed to do something that productions several times its length often fail to accomplish, which was to establish a character with enough specificity and emotional truth that the audience's relationship with that character proved to be durable across decades. People who watched the Bardock special in 1991 were still thinking about Bardock when Dragon Ball Super Broly opened in theaters in 2018, and the connection between those 2 points of engagement was maintained not by constant reminders or follow-up content, but by the quality of the original impression. That durability of impression is the mark of a story that told the truth about something, not factual truth in the sense of accurately representing some specific real-world phenomenon, but emotional truth in the sense of representing accurately what it feels like to be caught between wanting to change something and being unable to change it, between seeing clearly and not being believed, between caring about a future you will not live to see and finding a way to care about it anyway. These are experiences that have nothing specifically to do with Dragon Ball or Saiyans or the Frieza Force. They are experiences that belong to the general category of being a person in a world that does not adjust itself to match the urgency of individual needs. Bardock's story found those experiences inside the specific context of a science fiction franchise's prehistory and told them with enough honesty that they registered as true. The Dragon Ball franchise has produced many stories about fighting and power and the pursuit of ever greater strength. And within that catalog, the Bardock special stands apart as the story that most clearly said something about what all of that fighting and power and pursuit was built on top of. Every Super Saiyan transformation in Dragon Ball Z was built on a foundation that included what Frieza did to the Saiyan race. Every moment of Goku's growth as a warrior operated within a context of planetary destruction and the death of a father whose final vision had included him. The franchise did not require the audience to keep this context in mind at all times, and most of the time it was simply present in the background rather than foregrounded. But it was there, and the Bardock special was the piece that made it legible. The specific detail of power levels and their cultural significance in the Saiyan world adds texture to the story's treatment of Bardock's position in multiple ways. The Saiyan people organized their entire social structure around measurements of power, and the Daisen materials document specific numbers for the characters in Bardock's story with the precision that the franchise brought to that particular system of measurement. Bardock's 10,000 placed him well above the ordinary low-class soldiers who populated the Empire's foot troops, but well below the elite warriors whose power levels ran into the hundreds of thousands. Raditz, his elder son, was eventually documented as having a power level of 1,500, considerably below his father's 10,000, which represented its own kind of small irony given the pride the Saiyan hierarchy placed on the inheritance of capability. Kakarot's power level of 2 at birth was the number that the doctor on Planet Vegeta read and used to assign him to the lowest category of mission. That number, 2, represented essentially nothing in the context of the Frieza Force's military calculations. A power level of 2 was not a warrior. It was a biological starting point with almost no immediate combat application, belonging to a baby who needed years of development before any operational assessment would be worth running. In the context of the caste system, it locked Kakarot into the lowest designation before he had any capacity to demonstrate anything about what he might eventually become. The journey from 2 to the levels Goku would eventually achieve is in some sense the most complete possible demonstration of everything the Zenkai system and the Saiyan drive toward growth could produce when applied in full, not under the conditions of Saiyan military service, which was itself a significant accelerant, but under the conditions of a life lived on Earth among people who cared about him and taught him values that the Saiyan culture he had come from had never included in its vocabulary. The specific combination of Saiyan biology and human nurturing that produced Goku was not something either the Saiyans or the people of Earth could have specifically designed. It emerged from the specific accident of a pod landing in a forest and an old man finding what was inside it. That accident, and the chain of consequences that flowed from it, was what Bardock's final vision showed him. Not the accident itself, not the landing or the finding or the years of childhood, but the conclusion that those things eventually led to, the figure in orange standing over a defeated Frieza on a water-covered world. He could not have known the specific path. He could only see the destination, and the destination was enough to organize the chaos of what his grief had been building toward into something that had the quality of meaning, which is not the same as comfort, but is something that the specific kind of person Bardock was, could recognize and hold. The Dragon Ball franchise has occasionally been described as a story about finding reasons to push forward, about locating within the specific demands of extreme situations a quality of will that is not identical to the will that operates in normal circumstances. Bardock's story is one of the franchise's most direct explorations of this theme because it strips away the usual supports. There is no training montage, no growing understanding of technique, no mentor figure, no community of people who believe in him. There is a man who has lost everything that his life had been built around, who has seen a future he cannot change, arriving through a vision he cannot stop receiving, who charges toward the center of that future's cause with nothing but the fuel his grief is providing. That is not a story about finding power. That is a story about what a person does when they have made peace with the fact that power is not going to be enough. Bardock knew, by some level of awareness, that his 10,000 was not going to defeat Frieza. He had visions of the future. He understood, at least in the background of his consciousness, what the supernova was and what it meant for his chance of changing the immediate situation. He charged anyway, not from a mistaken belief that he could win, but from the simpler determination that charging was better than not charging, that the attempt mattered even when the outcome was already settled, that moving toward the thing you are facing is different in kind from simply being consumed by it. The conclusion of Bardock's story, after all the analysis and context and thematic consideration, is perhaps best approached in the quietest possible terms. He was a low-class warrior who was given slightly more awareness of his situation than anyone around him had, and that awareness cost him more than it gave him in every concrete sense, except one. The one exception was the window it opened in his final moment. The window showed him something that did not belong to him, that he could not own or possess or use. He could only see it, and then the window closed, and the supernova completed its work. What remained, after the planet was gone, and the debris of a civilization had dispersed into the space where it had existed, was a pod flying toward a small blue world, and in it, a baby who would grow up to be everything the vision had promised. Bardock did not know his son's name would become Goku. He did not know about the Kamehameha or the Kaioken, or the Spirit Bomb or the Golden Transformation that would make the legend of the Super Saiyan something other than a legend. He knew only what the vision had shown, which was enough. A future existed in which Frieza was defeated by someone who shared his blood. He had seen it. He died with it. That is the fact about Bardock that lives inside the Dragon Ball universe like a quiet stone at the bottom of a very deep current, present without announcing itself, shaping the flow above it without being seen. Every fight Goku has ever won, every transformation he has achieved, every moment in which he has stood between something terrible and the people he cares about, carries in its background the weight of a father who charged alone toward the thing he could not defeat and smiled in the last moment because he could see that his son was going to be all right. The Dragon Ball universe contains many heroes and many stories, and it has produced over decades an enormous catalog of moments that have resonated with the people who followed it. Among all of those moments, Bardock's smile remains one of the most specific and most quietly devastating because it asks nothing more than what it asks, which is to recognize that caring about a future you will not share in is still caring, and that dying with knowledge of something good is different from dying without it, and that the distance between those two things is exactly the distance between a tragedy and a tragedy that has found something to hold on to. That distance is what the Bardock special crossed in under an hour of airtime in October of 1990. For anyone who was paying close enough attention to notice, the Dragon Ball franchise has used its expansive history to return to certain themes and characters in ways that deepen rather than simply repeat what came before. And the treatment of Bardock's legacy across the franchise's multiple eras demonstrates this tendency clearly. In Dragon Ball Z itself, Bardock does not appear directly in the main narrative with any extended screen time, but his presence is felt through the way the Saiyan backstory operates as context for the events of the series. When Goku learns about his origins from Raditz, when Vegeta speaks of the Saiyan race and its destruction, when the history of Planet Vegeta is referenced in the context of Frieza's crimes, all of those moments are sitting on the foundation that the Bardock special built. The special was not required viewing to understand Dragon Ball Z, but watching it change the emotional texture of many of the Z series' key moments in ways that enriched rather than substituted for them. Raditz's arrival on Earth in the opening episodes of Dragon Ball Z represented the first time that the main narrative of the franchise directly addressed the existence of Goku's biological family and origins. The information Raditz provided was functional rather than sentimental, delivered in the tone of someone explaining an operational context rather than sharing family history. He told Goku about the Saiyan race, about Planet Vegeta, about the Empire Saiyans served, about the mission that had brought Goku to Earth, and the expected result of that mission, which had not been the expected result at all because of the head injury that had reset Goku's behavioral programming and allowed him to grow up into a person shaped by Earth's values rather than the Saiyan race's. None of what Raditz said included information about Bardock specifically. He was speaking from the perspective of the institutional Saiyan narrative, not from personal testimony about their father. This left Bardock's specific story as something that existed entirely outside the main series' knowledge base for its central characters. Goku never learned what his father had done in the final hours before Planet Vegeta's destruction. He never learned about the Squad, or Canasa, or the Visions, or the Charge, or the Smile. He received the basic factual information about being a Saiyan who had been sent to Earth as an infant, and he integrated that information in the way he integrated most information about himself, which was to receive it and then focus on the present circumstances rather than dwelling in its implications. The depth of Bardock's specific experience was not part of the story that the Dragon Ball Z main series gave its protagonist. This created a particular quality of dramatic irony that operated across the full span of the Frieza arc. As Goku powered up and transformed, and eventually defeated Frieza in the extended battle on Namek, the audience who had seen the Bardock special was carrying information that Goku himself did not have. They knew that a version of this confrontation, specifically the confrontation between a member of Goku's bloodline and Frieza, had been previewed in the visions of a dying warrior on the other side of a supernova. They knew that Bardock had seen this coming, and had died knowing it would happen. Goku stood over Frieza without any awareness that his father's final vision had been of exactly this moment, and the gap between what the audience knew and what the protagonist knew was precisely the space the Bardock special had opened. The Broly film's treatment of Bardock was significant not only for the content it added to his characterization, but for the specific decision it represented about how the franchise wanted to position his story in relation to its theatrical releases. The choice to open a film primarily about Broly with an extended sequence about Bardock and Jean and the sending of the infant Kakarot to Earth was a statement about what that backstory contributed to the franchise's emotional architecture. It suggested that the foundation of Goku's origins was worth treating as something more than a footnote, that the decision to open with it rather than simply summarizing it through dialogue later in the film represented a belief that the audience's experience of the main story would be richer for having started where Bardock started. The theatrical production quality applied to those opening minutes elevated the material in ways that the original special, produced for television broadcast in 1990, had not been able to achieve. The animation of the Broly film was among the most technically accomplished Dragon Ball material ever produced, with a style that blended the franchise's traditional visual language with approaches borrowed from contemporary action animation in ways that felt fresh while still clearly belonging to the same universe. The Bardock and Jin sequence received this treatment fully, which meant that the relatively quiet, emotionally focused story of parents saying goodbye to a child they were sending away was rendered with a visual richness that matched the scale of what it was doing thematically. Masako Nozawa returned to voice Bardock in the Broly film, reprising a role she had last performed in the original special decades earlier. and the performance she delivered for this version of the character reflected the differences in the characterization. The Bardock of Dragon Ball Minus and the Broly film opening was less sharp-edged than the original specials version, carrying the same fundamental vocal quality, but modulated toward a person who had something he was trying to preserve, rather than simply a person who was driving toward confrontation. The goodbye to the infant in the pod was not the kind of scene the original Bardock had been written for, and the performance found the right register for it, which was the register of someone doing something practical that has an enormous emotional cost that they are not going to acknowledge out loud. The question of whether the two versions of Bardock were reconcilable had been discussed with various levels of formality in Dragon Ball fan communities since Dragon Ball Minus was first published, and the consensus that emerged from those discussions was not a clean answer but rather an acceptance of the productive tension between them. Each version told a story that the other could not tell. The original special told a story about rage and grief and a charge toward an impossible opponent, and it needed Bardock to be the specific kind of warrior who would make that charge. Dragon Ball Minus told a story about parental love expressed through a practical act in the worst possible circumstances, and it needed Bardock to be the specific kind of person who could make that choice. The two Bardocks were each correct for the story they were in, and the fact that they did not perfectly overlap was a feature of the franchise's growth across 3 decades rather than an error in need of correction. The Daisen Shu volumes that documented the Dragon Ball universe in comprehensive reference form contain, among their extensive cataloging of characters and events, specific details about the Bardock special and the figures who appear in it that add texture to the already substantial portrait that the production created. The power levels of the squad members, the timeline of the events, the relationships between the various Frieza Force personnel involved in the decision to eliminate the Saiyans, all of these were documented with the care that the reference volumes brought to everything they covered. The existence of these resources meant that the world of Bardock's story was not sealed off from the rest of the Dragon Ball universe's documented history, but was instead integrated into it, given the same treatment as the major story arcs of the main series. Power-level documentation for the principal characters in Bardock's story tells its own quiet narrative when considered alongside the events of the special. Bardock at 10,000, the squad members at levels below his, reflecting the difference in accumulated combat experience. Dodoria, whose power level was documented at considerably higher figures, explaining the ease with which his elite soldiers had handled the squad without their own casualties. Frieza himself, whose multiple forms reached levels that made any individual combat with a warrior of 10,000 purely theoretical rather than a genuine contest. The numbers formed a hierarchy that mirrored the social hierarchy in specific ways, and the specific numbers in Bardock's story were always arranged such that the person at the top of the power hierarchy was also the person doing the most damage to those below them. The production of the Bardock special involved a team of skilled animators and directors working within the constraints of television broadcast quality in 1990, and the results they achieved within those constraints represented a high point in the franchise's television output for that era. The battle sequences had an energy and directness that served the material well, moving with enough pace to communicate the violence of the Saiyan culture being depicted without lingering in ways that would have shifted the production's tone away from the tragic and toward the gratuitous. The quiet scenes, of which there were enough to balance the combat sequences, were handled with a restraint that trusted the audience to supply emotional content rather than having the production announce it through musical or visual overstatement. The final sequence of the special, which followed Bardock's death with the landing of baby Goku's pod and the discovery of the infant by Grandpa Gohan, was a choice that created a specific kind of structural closure without requiring resolution in any of the ways the main narrative had left unresolved. The planet was gone. Bardock was gone. The squad was gone. Everything that the special had built its story around had been erased by the supernova, and the last image was a baby found by a kind old man in a forest. The specific starting point of a life that would eventually mean something enormous, even though at that moment it meant only this: a child who was alive and had been found by someone who would take care of him. That landing was the coda the story needed. It did not resolve anything that had been destroyed, did not bring anything back, did not offer comfort in any of the false ways that narratives sometimes offer comfort by pretending that loss can be undone. It offered instead the honest comfort of continuation, the fact that the story did not end with the supernova, even though everyone in the story who was destroyed by the supernova experienced it as an ending. The life in the pod continued. The future Bardock had seen continued. And those two facts, placed at the end of a story about everything that had been consumed by that supernova, said something about the relationship between endings and continuations that was worth carrying forward. There is a particular quality of attention that the best Dragon Ball stories reward, which is the quality of slow and patient observation that notices what is happening alongside the main narrative, as well as what is happening in the main narrative itself. The Bardock special rewards this kind of attention generously. The details of the world it built, the specific social structures and biological mechanisms and power-level documents and production choices that surrounded the central story, all of them contributed to an experience that deepened the more carefully it was approached. This is not always true of action animation produced for television broadcast, and the fact that the Bardock special achieved it within the constraints it was operating under speaks to the specific quality of the creative team that produced it. Bardock's story is, in one final framing, the story of what the Dragon Ball universe looked like before Goku entered it. Not the universe of the original series with its tournaments and Dragon Balls and martial arts masters, but the universe as the larger forces that shaped Goku's existence experienced it. The political and military universe of the Frieza Force, and the Saiyan race, and the systems of power and conquest that operated at the civilizational level before any individual hero arrived to push back against them. It was a universe with no Goku in it yet, where the closest thing to a protagonist was a low-class warrior whose proximity to the role was generated entirely by grief and the accident of a psychic gift, and where the ending was not triumph, but simply the specific, limited solace of a final vision. That universe existed for a long time before the pod landed on Earth, and before the old man in the forest found what was inside it. Everything that preceded the landing, everything that built the context into which Goku would eventually grow and discover himself, was Bardock's universe rather than his, and Bardock navigated it with the only tools the universe had seen fit to give him. He found in those tools, at the very end, exactly enough to do the one thing that was still available to him, which was to know and to carry that knowledge far enough through the supernova to let it land on his face as a smile. That is what is worth carrying from Bardock's story, not the power level of 10,000, not the bandana, not the charge toward an emperor's ship, though all of those things are part of it. The thing most worth carrying is the specific quality of knowing something good about the future you will not see, and choosing to let that knowledge be enough, and turning it into the last expression your face makes in the moment before the energy takes you. That is Bardock. That is the whole of him that matters, pressed into the smallest possible container, worn on the face of a low-class Saiyan warrior in the last moment available to him. The relationship between Bardock's story and the broader emotional architecture of Dragon Ball Z is one that rewards consideration across multiple perspectives. Because the special was not simply an origin story in the conventional sense, origin stories typically function to explain the hero, to provide biographical context that makes their current capabilities or personality choices feel grounded in something specific. The Bardock special did not primarily explain Goku. Goku remained, after watching the special, exactly as he had been before it, a person whose upbringing on Earth with Grandpa Gohan had shaped him into someone who bore almost no visible trace of the civilization he had come from. The special was not illuminating Goku's character so much as it was illuminating the world he had been saved from, the specific texture of a civilization and a system, and a moment in history that his departure from Planet Vegeta had allowed him to grow up without. This distinction matters because it affects how Bardock's story functions within the larger franchise. If the special had been primarily about explaining Goku, its emotional weight would have been distributed differently, with more of it directed toward the connections between father and son, that the audience could carry forward into their experience of the main series. Because the special was primarily about Bardock and the world he inhabited, the weight fell instead on the texture of that world itself, on the specific quality of the Saiyan civilization's inner life as it approached its end, on what it felt like to be inside something that was about to be destroyed from the outside. The story invited its audience into a perspective that the main series had no mechanism for providing, and the invitation was accepted so thoroughly that the character who extended it became one of the most enduring in the franchise's history. Grandpa Gohan's role in the final sequence of the special is worth considering, even though his screen time in it is brief, because the contrast the special created between the world that had just been destroyed and the world into which Kakarot was arriving was one of its most carefully managed effects. Gohan found a baby in a forest and responded to that baby with the particular quality of kindness that would eventually shape the person Kakarot became. There was nothing transactional about Gohan's response to finding the infant. He did not calculate the power level of what he had found. He did not assess the strategic implications of a Saiyan infant landing on Earth. He found a baby, and he cared for it with the simple directness of a person for whom caring was the obvious response to encountering something that needed it. The contrast with the world the special had just been depicting could not have been more complete. A world built entirely around power level assessments and caste designations, and the systematic elimination of anything that posed a potential threat was replaced, in the final sequence, by a single image of uncalculating kindness directed at a being with a power level of 2. The thing the Saiyan hierarchy had classified as the least significant product of its civilization was, in this new context, simply a baby that an old man in a forest chose to take care of. The special ended with that image and let it carry the weight of everything it was contrasting with, which was all of the preceding story. That contrast was also an argument about what ultimately determined the outcome of the story the franchise was telling. The specific quality that allowed Kakarot to become Goku, to become the warrior who would defeat Frieza and eventually face every subsequent threat the Dragon Ball universe produced, was not his Saiyan biology alone. Though the biology was necessary, it was the combination of that biology with the specific values that Grandpa Gohan's care had built into him. Values that the Saiyan world would never have provided, and that Bardock's civilization, for all the power it produced, was constitutionally incapable of transmitting. The love that Gohan extended to the infant in the pod was in this reading as important to the eventual outcome as anything Bardock had done in his final hours. The two gifts, the biological starting point from the Saiyan lineage and the emotional framework from a human grandfather on a quiet world, combined to produce something that neither could have produced alone. The Frieza Force's administrative systems are worth attending to as context for understanding the specific shape of what happened to Bardock and his squad. Because the decision to eliminate the Saiyan race was not made in a vacuum, but within a specific kind of institutional structure that had its own logic and its own mechanisms for carrying out the decisions that emerged from the top of its hierarchy. Frieza operated a force with layered command structures, with elite soldiers who served as direct instruments of his will, and with a vast apparatus of soldiers and administrators below them who carried out the operational work of maintaining an empire that spanned a significant portion of the universe. The Frieza Force was not simply a collection of powerful warriors. It was an organization, and organizations have specific properties that individuals do not. One of those properties is the capacity to carry out large-scale decisions without requiring each individual participant to understand or endorse the full scope of what they are participating in. The soldiers on Planet Meat who ambushed Bardock's squad were executing orders that had been transmitted through channels. They understood their assignment in operational terms, which was to eliminate a specific squad on a specific planet at a specific time. They may or may not have understood that this action was a preliminary step in a plan to destroy the entire Saiyan race. The operational structure of the Frieza Force was built to allow exactly this kind of compartmentalization, where the scale of a decision was visible only to the people who had made it, while the people carrying it out operated within a much narrower frame of understanding. This compartmentalization was part of what made Bardock's warning to the other Saiyans on Planet Vegeta land so poorly. He was telling people who had grown up inside an organization's operational structure that the organization itself, the entity that gave their lives shape and purpose and even their social hierarchy its authority, had decided to eliminate them. He was asking them to believe something that required abandoning the institutional framework within which everything they knew about how the world worked was organized. And he was asking them based on a combination of a dying enemy warrior's last act on a conquered planet and a series of visions he had been having since then. The gap between the scale of what he was claiming and the credibility of the evidence he was presenting was, from the perspective of the other Saiyans, a gap that did not favor believing him. What the other Saiyans could not know, of course, was that the institutional framework they were reluctant to abandon was itself the thing being turned against them. The logic that said the Empire would not destroy its own useful tools was precisely the logic Frieza had calculated they would rely on, which bought the time he needed to prepare the supernova without facing organized resistance. The Saiyans' trust in the structure of the Frieza force was, in the end, one of the mechanisms of their own destruction. The hierarchy that had organized their lives had trained them to regard information from below as less credible. And Bardock came from below, and the training held even when holding it was fatal. The Saiyan elite warriors who were on Planet Vegeta at the time of its destruction occupied a specific position in the story's moral calculus that the special did not fully elaborate, but that sat in the background of everything. These were warriors who had benefited from the caste system, who had received advantages and protections and social standing on the basis of the same hierarchy that had sent Bardock and his squad to the margins. They died in the same supernova as the low-class soldiers they had spent their lives looking down on, which was the ultimate expression of what the hierarchy they had trusted actually thought of them. Every distinction the Saiyan caste system had drawn, every protection it had seemed to extend to those born into favorable positions, was rendered entirely irrelevant by the single decision of the Emperor who sat above all of it. In this sense, the destruction of Planet Vegeta was the Saiyan caste system's final argument against itself. The hierarchy had taught all of its participants to believe that position within it corresponded to security, that being high in the ranks meant being protected from the worst of what the world could do. The supernova disproved this completely without qualification. Without exception, the highest-born Saiyan elite on the surface of Planet Vegeta was no more protected from the supernova than the lowest-ranked foot soldier. Frieza did not calibrate his destructive force to leave the valuable members of the Saiyan hierarchy in place. He destroyed everyone equally, which was the only moment in Saiyan history when the caste system's distinctions were genuinely meaningless. Bardock was not on the planet's surface when the supernova hit. He was above it, in the space between the planet and Frieza's ship, already caught in the expanding energy of the same supernova that was about to destroy everything below him. He did not survive the destruction of Planet Vegeta. He died in the same event, just at a slightly different physical location, consumed by the leading edge of what the supernova expanded into as it moved toward the planet. The fact that he died separately from the people he had failed to warn, in the space that his charge toward Frieza had placed him, was its own kind of specific irony. He died trying, which was different from dying passively, but the difference in outcome between trying and not trying was, in this case, essentially zero. And yet the trying mattered, not as strategy, and not as military action, because as strategy and military action, it accomplished nothing. It mattered in the way that honest responses to impossible situations always matter, which is that they preserve something about the person making them that staying still would not have preserved. Bardock charged at Frieza because that is what the specific person he had become by the end of his story was capable of doing. A person who had absorbed the loss of his squad and the failure of his warning and the certainty of what was coming, and had arrived at a state where the only remaining act available was to charge. He was not choosing courage in the abstract. He was simply being unable to do anything other than what his grief and his will had shaped him into doing. The charge was the natural continuation of everything that had preceded it, and the only alternative was the kind of stillness that was not available to him. The Bardock special has been released in various formats across the years since its original broadcast, and the availability of those releases has shaped the community of people who have encountered it. The original Japanese broadcast version was what the first audience experienced in 1990. Home video releases, subsequent international distributions, and eventually digital availability through various platforms extended the reach of the special considerably beyond its original broadcast context. Each new audience arrived with whatever relationship they already had to Dragon Ball Z, which meant that different viewers came to Bardock's story with very different amounts of context already established, and the experience of the special shifted accordingly. A viewer who encountered the Bardock special before watching Dragon Ball Z, if such a path were possible, would receive a story about a warrior charging at a power he could not defeat, without the full benefit of knowing what it meant that the person in the final vision was going to win. A viewer who watched it after the Namek arc already knew that Goku had stood over Frieza, had seen the transformation and the battle, and the specific moment of defeat that Bardock's vision had promised. The special was constructed with the assumption that the audience would be carrying the Namek arc's outcome into their experience of it, and that the gap between what Bardock could only see in vision and what the audience already knew as established fact was the intended emotional architecture of the story. The dramatic irony was not accidental. It was the engine. The conversations within Dragon Ball's fan communities about Bardock have taken many forms. Across the decades since the special aired, from straightforward discussions of the character's canonical status to more extended examinations of what his story meant in relation to the franchise's larger themes. The question of how he fits into Dragon Ball's general philosophy about Saiyan heritage, and what it means for people like Goku, who carry that heritage without having been shaped by the culture that produced it, has generated particularly thoughtful responses because it touches on something the franchise itself was working through across multiple arcs and series. Dragon Ball Z's treatment of the Saiyan heritage was, to put it directly, complicated. The franchise needed Goku's Saiyan biology, the Zenkai system, the Great Ape transformation, the Super Saiyan potential, all of the specific physiological features of his origin, to function as the engine of the power escalation that the series was built around. At the same time, the franchise had established Goku's character through the original Dragon Ball series in ways that made him something the Saiyan culture of Bardock's world would have found genuinely alien, someone whose instincts ran toward protecting people and fighting fairly and caring about outcomes that had nothing to do with his own power. The two things existed together in the same character, the Saiyan biology and the human values, and the franchise's various treatments of that combination were never entirely consistent about which one was more fundamental. Bardock's story sat at the beginning of that question rather than at its resolution. He was the Saiyan side in its most unmediated form, the culture before Goku's departure from it, the world that the pod was taking Kakarot away from rather than toward. What the special did by telling his story honestly, without sentimentalizing the culture he was embedded in, or excusing what he had participated in, was to establish a baseline against which all subsequent discussions of Saiyan heritage could measure themselves. Goku's goodness was not a Saiyan inheritance. It was an Earth inheritance. The Saiyan inheritance was the capacity for the power and the specific biological mechanisms that made the power grow. What was done with that capacity was shaped by something else entirely, something that came from a forest on a quiet planet and a kind old man who found a crying baby in a pod. The specific detail of Bardock's power level reaching 10,000 through accumulated battle experience rather than through any single dramatic growth event is worth examining because of what it says about the pace at which real development happens. In Dragon Ball, dramatic power increases are often presented as transformations, as specific moments of breakthrough when a character's capabilities shift suddenly and visibly to a new level. Bardock's path to 10,000 was not presented this way. It was implied to have been gradual, the product of many battles survived and many recoveries undergone. The slow accumulation of the Zenkai system, operating across years rather than producing its result in a single catalytic moment. This made his power feel different in quality from the transformation-based increases the main series more commonly featured, more like something earned across a career than something achieved in a moment of extreme emotion. The Zenkai system itself, as the Dragon Ball universe understood it, was not fully unlimited. It responded to near-death experiences and produced growth, but the growth it produced was bounded by something that the series did not fully specify, but that operated as a practical ceiling on how far a given warrior could advance through this mechanism alone. Bardock's 10,000 was a genuine achievement within this system, a demonstration of what sustained survival could build over the course of a career. But it was also, in the context of the Frieza Force's power hierarchy, clearly insufficient for the task his story required of him. The gap between 10,000 and what would be needed to actually defeat Frieza was not a gap that more battles survived could have closed in any realistic time frame. The system that built Bardock's power was also the system whose limits defined his ceiling. This was part of what made his story specifically about a low-class warrior, rather than about the kind of elite that might have had different numbers available. Had Bardock been an elite Saiyan with a power level in the hundreds of thousands, his charge at Frieza would have been a different kind of story, one where the outcome was at least theoretically contestable within the existing power framework. By keeping him at 10,000, by making him someone who had exceeded his designation through genuine accumulation, but who was still vastly below what the specific problem of Frieza required, the story preserved the specific quality of his charge, which was not a reasonable military attempt, but something closer to a statement, a refusal to be passive about what was happening regardless of what the mathematics of the situation indicated. The role of Dodoria in Bardock's story is worth a sustained look because he functions as the story's instrument for a specific kind of institutional violence that is different in character from the violence of individual combat. Dodoria did not fight Bardock's squad himself in the Bardock Special. He dispatched soldiers to Planet Meat, and those soldiers did the work. The organizational distance between the decision-maker and the action was maintained throughout, which communicated something about the nature of the threat Bardock was actually facing. He was not facing an individual enemy who could be located and confronted. He was facing a decision made at the top of a hierarchy and transmitted through layers until it arrived at his squad's location in the form of soldiers. The personalization of that threat as Dodoria, as a specific face and a specific position in the organizational chart, was the story's way of making the institutional violence legible in human terms, giving it a body and a face so that the audience and Bardock both had somewhere to direct the understanding of what had happened. In the broader Dragon Ball Z narrative, Dodoria's presence in the Namek arc placed him in the story at a point where audiences who had seen the Bardock Special could carry the specific weight of what he represented in that context. He was the person who had arranged the elimination of Bardock's squad. He was, in the chain of causation that led from Frieza's decision to the deaths on Planet Meat, the link between the Imperial decision and the operational execution. Seeing him on Namek, functioning as Frieza's enforcer in the ongoing arc of the main series, was for Bardock's Special viewers a moment of doubled recognition. A character who existed both in the main series present tense and in the backstory that the Special had made vivid. Zarban occupied a similar position of doubled recognition, though his role in the Bardock Special was more observational than operational. He witnessed the events of Bardock's charge from a position adjacent to Frieza, and the specific expression that crossed his face during those events was worth attending to because it seemed to register something. Not sympathy exactly, because Garban was not a character built for sympathy in any direction that cost him anything personally, but something like the recognition of implication, a brief window through which the logic of serving Frieza was visible from a slightly more personal angle than the operational efficiency he otherwise maintained. The soldiers who died alongside Bardock in the supernova were also Frieza's soldiers. They were also replaceable. The fact that Frieza had directed them to hold the line and then consumed them in the same energy he used to destroy the Saiyans they were nominally protecting was information that Carbone and Dodoria were in a position to absorb. Whether they did absorb it and what weight they assigned to it was not something the Special chose to develop, because it was not primarily their story. But the moment was placed there, visible and available, contributing to the texture of the Frieza Force as a setting in ways that went beyond what a straightforwardly villainous depiction of Frieza's court might have provided. The complexity of operating within a structure controlled by someone who would consume his own soldiers in the execution of a larger plan was built into the background of the special's final sequence, present without demanding explicit acknowledgement. The specific symbolism embedded in Bardock's attack against the supernova, the small blue sphere of concentrated energy aimed at an enormous expanding mass of destruction, has been read in various ways by people who have thought carefully about the visual language of the special. The color and the compact quality of Bardock's attack placed it in conversation with other significant energy attacks in the Dragon Ball universe, and while the specifics of those connections were not stated directly by the production, the visual rhyme was available to audiences who had been watching the franchise for any length of time. A small, contained thing moving toward a large, expansive thing and being absorbed by it is an image with deep roots in the vocabulary of how power and scale work against each other. And the special used it with the efficiency that comes from placing it in a context that had already done the work of making the viewer care about the small thing. The expansion of the supernova absorbing Bardock's attack is, in direct terms, a visual statement about the relationship between his power level and Frieza's. 10,000 against 530,000 does not produce a contest. The absorption was complete and immediate and without drama, which was the correct visual choice because adding drama to that moment would have suggested a contest where none existed and would have muddied the story's commitment to honesty about the specific scale of the problem Bardock was facing. The supernova absorbed his attack the way a river absorbs a handful of water, and the image was allowed to be exactly what it was, without embellishment. After the absorption, in the final moments before the supernova completed its work, the story made its most important choice, which was to slow down rather than to accelerate. The expected rhythm of an action sequence reaching its climax would be to increase pace, to drive forward with increasing intensity toward the moment of maximum impact. The Bardock special did the opposite in these final seconds, slowing to the pace of the vision, letting the image of Goku on the water-covered world arrive with the deliberateness of something important being fully received. The slowdown was the story's way of insisting that this moment be given the attention it required, that the audience not rush past it in the momentum of what the action sequence had been building, that the smile and what it meant be present long enough to actually register. This pacing choice was one of the special's most skillful decisions, and it is worth naming as such because pacing in animation is difficult to execute well, particularly in moments where the audience's energy has been raised by combat and needs to be shifted to a more reflective frequency, without simply stopping everything cold. The slowdown worked because it was graded, rather than sudden. The action unwinding gradually as the energy of the supernova reached and enveloped Bardock, the vision arriving in the slowing space that the unwinding created, the smile landing in the quietest moment of the sequence where the full weight of the story that had preceded it could be felt in it. Dragon Ball's relationship with death and loss across its long history has been more complicated than the franchise's surface-level presentation of combat as adventure would suggest. Characters die, characters are revived by the Dragon Balls, characters die again. The cycle of death and revival became one of the franchise's most discussed features as it extended across decades. The Bardock special occupied a specific position within this cycle because the deaths it depicted were not reversible in any way available to the Dragon Ball Z timeline. The Saiyan race was gone, Planet Vegeta was gone. None of this was going to be addressed by Dragon Ball wishes or by any other mechanism the franchise had developed for managing death's permanence. The destruction in the Bardock special was of the kind that simply was, that the story was not going to apologize for or undo. This made the Bardock special's treatment of loss feel different in texture from the main series treatment of the deaths that surrounded its major battles. In Dragon Ball Z, the audience eventually learned that most deaths could be addressed through the Dragon Balls if sufficient motivation existed to gather them. This knowledge changed the emotional weight of loss in the main series in ways that were frequently discussed. The observation that a character's death meant less when revival was technically available. The Bardock special had no such cushion. The losses it depicted were real in the specific sense that the Dragon Ball universe applied to the word real, permanent in a way that the main series' deaths often were not, and the emotional weight they carried was distributed accordingly. The special's honesty about the permanence of its losses was part of what gave it its specific gravity in the franchise's overall catalog. It was the story that showed what loss looked like when the Dragon Balls were not an available response, when the Empire's decision was final, in the way that only truly Imperial power can make a decision final, when the people who died were simply gone and the world they had built was simply not there anymore. This quality distinguished the special from almost everything else in the Dragon Ball Z library and contributed significantly to its enduring reputation as one of the more emotionally serious pieces of content the franchise had produced. Akira Toriyama's creative process across his work on Dragon Ball is documented in various interview sources and in the Daisen Shu materials, and the picture that emerges from those documents of how he approached the ongoing development of his franchise is useful context for understanding why the Bardock special landed with him the way it did. Toriyama has described his own creative instincts as running toward comedy and lightness, toward adventure that did not linger too long in darkness, toward a fundamental optimism about the outcome of struggles that was built into his sense of how stories should move. The original Dragon Ball series reflected these instincts clearly, with its specific combination of humor and action, and the genuine warmth that animated Goku's relationships with the people around him. Dragon Ball Z, as the franchise expanded in scope and the stakes escalated to include planetary destruction and universal consequences, pushed further into darkness than the original series had gone. But even Dragon Ball Z maintained a fundamental structure in which the good outcome was always eventually achievable. Battles could be desperate and deaths could be real, but the trajectory was generally toward resolution, toward Goku or his allies finding a way through. The Bardock special operated outside this structure by definition because its ending was already fixed by everything that had come before it in the main series. Planet Vegeta was gone. Bardock was gone. The resolution the story offered was not victory, but vision, not salvation, but knowledge. And the specific quality of that resolution was something that Toriyama's own creative instincts, by his own description, would not have naturally produced. This is part of why his acknowledgement of the special carried the weight it did. He was not simply affirming that the production team had done good work within the conventions of the franchise. He was recognizing that they had found something in his universe that existed beyond the edges of his own natural reach as a storyteller, and that this thing they had found was worth having. The Bardock special was a gift the production team gave to Dragon Ball's universe, and Toriyama received it as such, which was the specific generosity of someone secure enough in their own creative vision to appreciate what a different creative vision had found inside it. The legacy of the Bardock special in the context of the full Dragon Ball franchise is by now long enough to be measured in decades rather than in years, and the character it introduced has proven to have a durability that goes well beyond what a single special of under an hour's runtime would normally produce. The explanation for that durability is ultimately not complicated, though it has many layers. Bardock's story was told honestly. It did not pretend that he was something other than what he was. It did not soften the world he came from, or the things he had participated in. And it did not manufacture a redemption arc that would have let the audience feel comfortably about him without having done the work of actually engaging with the full complexity of his situation. It gave him a grief that was real, and a response to that grief that was real, and it allowed all three of those things to be exactly as heavy as they were. That heaviness was what the audience held on to, not the power level or the design or the specific sequence of events, though all of those were executed skillfully enough to serve the story well. The thing that lasted was the specific quality of honest weight that the story carried, the sense that something real was being said about what it costs to see clearly and be unable to act on what you see, about what it means to care about a future you will not share in, about what is available to a person at the end of everything when everything else has already been taken. These are not Dragon Ball questions. They are simply questions, and Bardock's story answered them with the specific honesty that earns a story its place in the memory of the people who receive it.